Good morning. If you got a Bible with you, I'd recommend turning to 1 Kings chapter 2. We'll be looking at those four verses Joseph read for us a couple minutes ago, and then going a little bit further than that, but mainly focusing on those four. We have an idea in at least our society. It seems like every society has this idea. The idea of someone's last words. That when a person is dying, their last request or their last wishes or whatever the thing is that they say right before they go, those are important. Because what it reminds us of, it reminds us that everybody's temporary. And these are the things they want to communicate before they go. These are the things of most importance to them. This is the one idea that matters the most to them. And if they could only say one more thing, here's what it is. And so, is it any wonder that we put some importance on the idea of last words, on the idea of the last things that a human being communicates? Maybe it's helpful for us to examine different words from people. And when you look at different characters in the Bible, you do get a few testaments of last words. Moses' last words is really the whole book of Deuteronomy, isn't it? That's the most important thing he has to tell the people of Israel is the entire law of God. That's who he was. Jesus' last words when he's here on this earth, or when he's here on the cross, right before he dies, before getting resurrected, those last words have value. They're the things Jesus wished to communicate before he left. Maybe we can look at David's last words and see what David thought about as he was leaving this life. David is, as he's often called, the man after God's own heart. He was a man of faith, somewhat kind of a triumph of faith. Now, he had some issues, absolutely. He was not perfect in any sense of the word, and yet he did try. And he always came back to God. We remember David, he's the best king Israel had. It's not saying all that much, but he's the best king that those people had. He was the man of faith. And so, as he is dying, as he is getting old, he's ready to pass on the kingdom to Solomon. And he has one last thing to say. What are the words of this man of faith? What are the things that he focuses on? We're going to read 1 Kings chapter 2. We're going to read verses 1 through 4. Really, David speaks all the way through verse 9. The main thrust of what he's saying is in those first four verses. We'll touch on verses 5 through 9 in a bit, but I want to focus primarily on those first four verses. 1 Kings 2, verse 1. As David's time to die drew near, he commanded his son Solomon, saying, I am going the way of all the earth. So be strong and prove yourself a man. Do your duty to the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, and his testimonies, according to what is written in the law of Moses, so that you may succeed in all that you do and wherever you turn, so that the Lord may fulfill his promise, which he spoke to me regarding me, saying, if your sons are careful about their way, if they walk before me in truth with all their heart and all their soul, then you shall not be deprived of a man to occupy the throne of Israel. Again, he goes on in verses 5 through 9. We'll read those in a few minutes and make those points. But for now, what I want you to recognize is that he distills in these four verses, he distills three very essential components for Solomon to live a good and successful life, even here on earth. He talks about the importance of a complete obedience to the Lord your God. He talks about the necessity of a personal resolution that you're going to do these things. And then he reminds Solomon of the assurance of a resulting blessedness from following the law of God. If you want a good life on this earth, these are the things you need to do. It's these three things. They're very simple. And so we'll start with number one. The importance of complete obedience. Do you see when you read those four verses, do you see the emphasis that David places on what Solomon ought to do? He says, be strong and prove yourself a man. And then he says, do your job. What's your job? It's listen to God over and over and over again. First thing he addresses is he says, hey, Solomon, keep in mind while you come into power, while you're starting to take over, keep in mind that death is a natural part of life. Keep in mind that I am going the way of all the earth. I'm dying just like everybody else will. Solomon, one day you're going to do that too. One day all of us here are going to do that too. It's the way of the earth. You live for a while and then you die. Be strong and do your work while you're here. You only have a limited time to fulfill the things of God. You only have a limited amount of time to declare your faith in Jesus. You only have a limited amount of time to work as the Lord wills. Death is coming for us all. So give yourself to God while you can. And that's really the thrust of the section is remember that God is the king. Solomon, you're inheriting a kingship. And as we'll see in following chapters, Solomon's kingship is the richest and most prosperous Israel ever was. He had the most amount of land Israel ever had. He had the finest cattle that Israel ever had access to. He had the best of everything. And yet God comes in, and David comes in and says, you need to listen to God. Because God is the one who's setting the rules for you. Even though you're a king, God gets to tell you what to do. God is the king. If you remember from Ephesians chapter 6, we're talking about that idea of slaves and masters. God's commandment for masters, Ephesians 6, verses 8 and 9, I believe it is. Remember his commandment? His commandment is, masters, be kind to your slaves, because you might be a master on earth, but you have one who's in charge of you in heaven. Solomon, you might be rich. You might be powerful. You might be in charge of all sorts of things. You might have all sorts of inheritance. You might have a high position in whatever company. You might be on top of the world, as it were, but you have a ruler in heaven. No matter how high you get in this world, you still are under the Lord. Commit yourself to him, because he's still the judge at the end of the day. God has given us all a measure of control. He's given us all a measure of authority in our own lives. He's given us all a different position in our lives in whatever way. Use that to serve him and follow his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, his testimonies, and what is written in the law of Moses, so that you will succeed. God expects us to use the blessings he gives to serve him. And so he calls us to obey every command that is given to us. And there's no wiggle room left for a half-hearted obedience. Either you're obeying every command or you're not. Either you are following the law or you've broken the law. There is no in between, right? If I don't murder, that's great. If I don't commit tax fraud, that's wonderful. But if I still go and steal something else, I'm still a lawbreaker and I still go to prison. Either you're following the whole law or you're not following the law. Either you're with God or you're not. God is not one for partial obedience. He doesn't want 50% of your allegiance and you can do whatever you want to with the other part. No, either you're following him or you're not. And so don't aim for a bare minimum. Don't think 70% is a passing grade on this one. Either you're following God, either you're giving him everything, or you're keeping something back and he's going to require it at the judgment day. Doesn't matter how high up you get in this life. God is in control. And if he's in control, you need to be obedient to the things he says. And that's where it kind of starts hitting home to each of us, because we're not Solomon. We're not in this high position. We're not inheriting a kingship. At least nobody that I know here is doing that. But what are we? We're human beings who are individually responsible for following the Lord our God. And that's when you start to notice, as you look at this passage, David makes this application very specifically to Solomon as an individual. You can't just say, I'm going to be faithful to God and vaguely do a couple things and follow God in that way. No, David says, be strong. He says, be a man. And he says, You be strong. You prove yourself a man. You are the one who's supposed to do your duty to the Lord your God. You walk in his ways. You keep his statutes. You keep his commandments. You keep his ordinances. You keep his testimonies so that you might succeed in all that you do and wherever you go. You notice how much emphasis there is on the person of Solomon being totally committed. We have this strange idea that we can somehow follow God part-time, but not really be in it ourselves. We can kind of project the idea of following God. We can vaguely say some things about faith, and then God's going to count those things to us, but he doesn't care if we're actually involved or not. That's false. That's just fake. That's not how it works. God is calling for you to be committed. If you are not committed, then you are not going to be with him. That's the commandment. And so David comes in and he says, Solomon, you need to do all these things. And that means, unfortunately, you're going to be fighting a lot. Firstly, Solomon, you are going to be fighting yourself. Be strong and prove yourself a man. Are those things that are comfortable to do? Are those things that are enjoyable? If God were to say, you, be strong, be a godly man or a Christian woman or whatever. If God were to come down and say, you have to commit yourself entirely to me. We all have some things that we don't want to commit to God, don't we? We all have a few things inside that don't really align with what God wants for us. And it would be really convenient if we didn't have to give those up. And it would be so much more pleasant if we could just kind of ignore that. No. Either you're following this law or not. Are you committed to following the statutes and the ordinances of the Lord? But it's not just you. It's not just internal conflict that's going to be an issue. If you want to be strong, if you want to prove yourself to be a faithful person, then you're also going to have to fight your friends, aren't you? It's not just about you. Are there people around you? Are there people that you know, people who have influence on you who are not 100% aligned with God either? Who have their influence on you, and they don't use that to push you towards faith. They use that to kind of maybe pull you away, or at least make you not commit as much, at least make you not commit to such a degree. Oh, you can go to church once, but you don't have to go twice. Oh, you can go to worship on Sunday morning. You don't have to go to Bible class. It's not that important. Do you have people in your life that maybe are not fully aligned with God? That maybe aren't there themselves, and so they try and pull you away. So David continues in verse 5. There's a whole unpleasant set of verses we don't like talking about. In verses 5 through 9, David starts talking to Solomon. Rather, he continues his address and he focuses it on this topic. You yourself also know what Joab the son of Zeruiah did to me. And you know what he did to the two commanders of the armies of Israel, to Abner, son of Ner, and Amasa, the son of Yether, whom he killed. He shed the blood of war in peace, and he put the blood of war on his belt that was on his waist and on the sandals that were on his feet. Joab was a murderer, if you don't know. He was also David's nephew, I believe. And so David didn't take any vengeful action on Joab, but he should have. And so, verse 6, so act as your wisdom dictates. Do not let his gray hair go down to Sheol, the realm of the dead, in peace. Show kindness to the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite. Let them be among those who eat at your table. They assisted me when I fled from Absalom your brother. And behold, you also have with you Shimei the son of Gera, the Benjamite of Bahurim. Now it was he who cursed me with a painful curse on the day I went to Mahanaim. But when he came down to meet me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, saying, I will not put you to death with the sword. But now you do not leave him unpunished. You are a wise man. You will know what to do with him. You will bring his gray hair down to Sheol with blood. That's not a very pleasant way to end off your address. And yet, what is David saying? There are some people around you who are going to be detriments. There are people around you who are trying to drag you away from God. And there are people around you who are trying to support you. So be wise in those you let influence yourself. Divide wisely between those who are faithful and who are encouraging you and those who are dragging you away. Joab is out. Shimei is out. Sons of Barzillai, those guys are helpful. You bring them close to you. You're going to have to fight your friends. You're going to have to fight with those around you who aren't aligned with God. You're going to have to cut some things out. You're going to have to bring some other things in. If you want to be aligned with God, you're going to have to fight even those who are close to you. We have plenty of things around us that influence us and push us in a direction. Take out the things that are bad and replace them with things that are proper. And more than that, Solomon, it's not just you, it's not just your friends and the people right around you. You're also going to have to fight your society and everything that's pushing on you from a national level. We live in a society that is not God focused. Solomon also lived in a society not focused on the Lord. In fact, in Solomon's early days, what is he seen doing? He's seen sacrificing on all the hills around to a variety of different gods. He cleans up his act a little bit. He's faithful to the Lord his God a little bit, and then at the end of his life, he goes right back into it and walks away again. God is calling us to be aware. David is calling us to be aware that things that society is going to influence you away from God. You got to push that off. You got to put that aside. You got to step away from those things and say no. Because society is going to try to compel you to step in line with everyone else, and everyone else is against the Lord. Don't be there. Are you committed to following the Lord your God? Are you committed to following every commandment? This is not something where you can say, oh, yeah, I'm a Christian. I follow the Bible. I go to church, and that's it. No, are you committed in your personal life? When you leave here, do you continue in these things? When you leave here, do you seek out God, or do you find yourself distracted and pulled away from the variety of other things? Talked a lot in our class about distractions, about taking time throughout your day to focus on God and how that's difficult to do because so many things outside of us push on us. Yes, absolutely. So cut some of those things out to focus on the Lord. It is your job, Solomon, to pursue righteousness. It's your job in this leadership position to lead others to righteousness. And so make sure that you are righteous. Make sure you surround yourself with righteous people and make sure that the influences on you are pushing you towards something that is good. Solomon, if you do this, if you're completely obedient to God, and if you yourself are getting involved, if you are committing yourself every day, then you know that good things will happen. That's the promise in the end of verse 3. If you keep your job, if you walk in God's ways, if you keep his statutes, if you keep his commandments, then you will succeed in all that you do and wherever you turn. Keep these things so that the Lord might fulfill his promise that he made to me, saying, if your sons are careful to walk in my way, if your children are obedient to me, then I will always keep them. I'll always have one to occupy the throne of Israel. If you are faithful, then there are rewards. God will bless you if you obey. That's the point. That's the selling point of obedience. Yes, it takes a lot, but the reward is immeasurable. And unfortunately, you get to see this mapped out in the rest of 1 Kings. You get to see Solomon ruling under the Lord and following God. And when Solomon rules under the Lord, his territory expands and his wealth balloons and his wisdom increases, and he's so impressive to everyone all over the world. Solomon's rule goes beautifully as long as he stays faithful, and then he starts to walk away. And then it all crumbles. And then he starts to walk away and lose the commands of God. He has all the wisdom in the world, and it all turns out for nothing. If you believe he wrote Ecclesiastes, then you know exactly where he ended up. just realizing everything was worthless and none of it meant anything because he didn't follow the Lord. He fell into vanity. The man who had riches and power and wealth and horses, as odd as that is, those were his markers of success. And it all goes to nothing because he doesn't follow the Lord. David wanted Solomon to follow God. Because if you do those things, and if you commit yourself fully, and if you get personally involved, you will be blessed for it. David experienced that in his life. He did not commit fully, he was punished for those things. But every time he turned around, God brought him back, and at the end of his life, he has a good relationship with God. God will bless you if you obey. It's a promise he knew, it's a promise he passed on. But Solomon, unfortunately, doesn't. And so we see it all fall apart. The conclusion to all of this is very simple, right? We are not Solomon. We're not inheriting the kingdom of Israel. We're not in his place exactly. But we can pull a few different lessons from the words of David directly. And the fact is, David says, number one, you know that being God's, it gives you strength. You're called to be strong. How does that work? How does it look to be strong? Do your duty to the Lord your God. What does it mean to be strong? It means follow God's commandments. What does it mean to have that core strength? It means to be God's. Be strong in the Lord, in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God. Ephesians 6. I'm not going to preach Ephesians 6 again, don't worry. Being God's gives you a strength that you can't get anywhere else. Dedicate yourself to being his. Being God's gives you success. Success in everything that you do. Even though Christians may not find every business venture of theirs a monetary gain, even though maybe our personal relationships don't always work out the way we want to, even though our life circumstances may not be as easy as we wish, God makes all things work together for good to those who love him. And when you look back in your life, you can see the impact that God's hand has had as he helps you through. He gives us success. It might not look like worldly success, but we know that he is faithful and he gives us a blessing when we follow him. We've seen it happen. You've seen it happen. You're well aware of those things, I hope. And thirdly, being God's gives you a form of stability in the world. A lot of people in this world complain about life because life fluctuates a lot. Life is very difficult. Life goes in all sorts of different directions, and we're not really sure where to ground ourselves, and we're always kind of up in the air. The economy changes and everybody's upset. Your housing situation isn't as simple as you would like, and everything's confusing, and we don't know where to go. Those who have a faith in God do know where to go. Because God gives us a stability. If your sons walk in my ways, they will always be before me. If you are faithful, God will see to it that you have enough. Might not be comfortable, but it is enough. God's promise, Old and New Testament, is those who show faith in him are rewarded by a life with him and by salvation and by having enough in this life. When you're with him, even the darkest of moments look light. If you've got God on your side, even when you face death, you know it's just a doorway to the next life. When you've got God on your side, nothing can shake you. He is the foundation of your life. That's what David wants you to have. Those are the benefits of a life with God. Those are the things that David wants his son to have, and by extension, I think he wants all of us to have. Those are the things that we've been given. Those are the promises God has blessed us with. And so the question is, are those blessings something you're interested in or not? If you are, God's already told you how to achieve them. If you are, David's already given the blueprint for how to go about it. It's called being obedient to God. It's called you getting involved. It's called you trusting in the promises of the Lord. and following after him. We have a promise from God, don't we? We have many promises from God. Promise of salvation, a promise of forgiveness, a promise of purification from old sins that used to cling to us, but through Jesus' blood they are forgiven. A promise that when we seek the Lord, that everything will go well, and that we will find him and be with him forever. If that's something you're interested in, a nice life in the physical and a better one in the future, if that's something that you're interested in, then by all means, you're welcome to seek it. Come talk to me. Let's start working through that. I'll be standing right here as we all stand and sing this song together.